For decades, scientists pictured the first Americans as small bands of hunters crossing a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska. Their ancestry traced back to a single origin in Northeast Asia. But ancient DNA has overturned this simple narrative. Recent studies reveal that these early migrants carried a far more complex genetic heritage, one shaped not only by Siberian and East Asian roots, but also by fragments inherited from archaic humans, like Neanderthals and Denisovans. One Denisovan-derived gene, still present in many indigenous groups today, may have provided vital immune advantages as people spread into unfamiliar environments. Other discoveries show that the first Americans emerged from a fusion of ancient North Eurasian and East Asian lineages around 20,000 years ago. From this population came the earliest branches, the ancient Beringians in Alaska, and the groups that moved rapidly southward into the rest of the continent. In South America, the story becomes even more intricate. DNA evidence points to multiple migration waves and perhaps even lineages that no longer exist, suggesting that the first American story is not one of a single migration, but of complexity, survival, and deep ancestry still visible in indigenous peoples today. Early theories versus new evidence. For much of the 20th century, the Clovis first model defined how scholars understood the peopling of the Americas. According to this framework, humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. From there, they supposedly traveled south through an ice-free corridor in central Canada, spreading rapidly across the continent. The model drew its strength from the discovery of finely crafted spear tips, Clovis points, found in association with extinct Ice Age animals. For decades, this archaeological pattern was seen as the earliest footprint of humans in the New World. Yet challenges soon emerged. In the 1970s and 1980s, discoveries at Monte Verde in southern Chile revealed human occupation more than 14,500 years ago, predating Clovis technology by at least a millennium. Other sites in Florida, Oregon, and the mid-Atlantic suggested human presence even earlier. These findings raised a major problem. How could people reach South America before the ice-free corridor existed? The evidence pointed instead to alternative migration routes, most likely along the Pacific coastline, where early seafarers may have followed rich marine resources southward. The collapse of the Clovis first model opened space for more complex interpretations. Some archaeologists proposed multiple migration waves, while others argued that small groups may have lingered for millennia in Beringia before dispersing. But archaeology alone could not settle these debates. The fragmentary nature of sites, disagreements over dating, and the absence of clear cultural continuity kept the controversy alive. It was only with the rise of ancient DNA research that a clearer picture began to emerge. Genetic evidence would show that the story of the first Americans was not a single migration event, but the unfolding of a far deeper and more intricate process.
The birth of the first Americans. The genetic trail of the first Americans begins not in the Americas, but in Siberia during the last ice age. Ancient DNA recovered from a 24,000-year-old burial near Lake Baikal revealed a population known as the ancient North Eurasians. These people were genetically related to both Europeans and Native Americans, but their lineage eventually disappeared from Eurasia itself. Meanwhile, further east, populations related to East Asians were moving northward into colder environments. Sometime between 20,000 and 23,000 years ago, these two groups met. Their mixing created a new population, what geneticists now call the ancestral Native Americans. This group carried roughly equal parts of ancient, North Eurasian, and East Asian ancestry. Unlike their parent populations, they became isolated in a region known as Beringia, the now submerged landmass that once connected Siberia and Alaska. For several thousand years, these people lived in what researchers describe as a Beringian standstill, cut off from both Asia and the Americas by massive glaciers. It was during this isolation that the ancestral Native Americans developed a distinct genetic profile. They were not simply a branch of Siberians or East Asians, but a unique people whose DNA forms the foundation of nearly all indigenous groups in the Americas today. When the ice sheets began to retreat around 16,000 years ago, new pathways opened, and this population expanded into the Americas. The genetic evidence points to a rapid dispersal once conditions allowed. Within a few thousand years, groups derived from this ancestral population occupied landscapes from Alaska to South America. Yet even in this early phase, they did not remain a single, unified lineage. Branches emerged, some of which thrived and others that eventually disappeared. The next chapter reveals how those splits shaped the human landscape of the Americas. Branches, journeys, and lost peoples. Once the glaciers began to retreat, the ancestral Native Americans spread out of Beringia into the rest of the continent. Ancient DNA shows that one of the earliest splits created a lineage now called the Ancient Beringians, identified through the remains of two infants buried at the Upward Sun River site in Alaska, about 11,500 years ago. Their DNA revealed a branch that separated from the main ancestral population, roughly 20,000 years ago. Unlike the groups that moved south, the ancient Beringians remained in the north and eventually vanished as a distinct people, likely absorbed by later arrivals. Meanwhile, other groups moved southward with remarkable speed. By 14,500 years ago, humans were already present at Monte Verde in Chile. Genetic evidence confirms that these migrants diversified quickly into at least two broad lineages, one remaining in the north, the other moving into Central and South America. This early division explains the deep genetic differences that persist among indigenous populations today. But not all findings fit neatly into this two-branch model. Ancient DNA from Brazil and the Andes revealed faint but consistent signals linking some South American groups to populations in Australasia, such as indigenous Australians and Papuans. While still debated, this suggests that an additional early migration may have contributed to the genetic landscape of South America, one that left little trace elsewhere. Unexpectedly, there is also evidence of reverse migrations. Genetic markers in northeastern Siberia show that after the Americas were settled, some groups carrying Native American ancestry moved back across the land bridge into Asia. These findings reveal that the settlement of the Americas was not a one-way journey, but part of a wider network of movements across continents. The first Americans were not a single people, but a web of lineages, some enduring, others disappearing. Yet all carried with them deeper legacies, traces of even older ancestors, the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Archaic legacies in their DNA. Long before the first Americans set foot in Beringia, their ancestors in Eurasia had already mingled with older human lineages. As modern humans spread across Asia more than 40,000 years ago, they encountered and interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, archaic groups that later disappeared but left behind a genetic legacy. Those fragments survived the journey across the land bridge and remain visible in the DNA of indigenous peoples today. One of the most striking examples is a Denisovan-derived variant of the MUC19 gene, which plays a role in producing mucus. This adaptation may have strengthened immune defenses against pathogens in challenging new environments. Remarkably, the variant is still common in many indigenous populations of the Americas, suggesting that it provided a lasting survival advantage. Other inherited sequences came from Neanderthals. These fragments are scattered across the genome and affect traits ranging from immunity to metabolism and even how skin responds to sunlight. For early populations moving through diverse environments, Arctic tundra, temperate forests, deserts, and tropical lowlands, such genetic tools could mean the difference between survival and failure. Far from being minor curiosities, these archaic contributions likely shaped how the first Americans adapted to the continent. In places where diets shifted dramatically, or where exposure to new diseases posed constant risks. Inherited genetic resilience offered a critical edge. The presence of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA also underscores a deeper truth. The ancestry of the first Americans was never a straight line. Instead, it was a mosaic, layer upon layer of interwoven histories, stretching back into earlier chapters of human evolution. Yet their story is not only about ancient inheritances. Modern DNA reveals continuity as well. Many of these lineages, adaptations, and ancestries live on today among indigenous peoples, whose genetic diversity reflects both deep antiquity and unique local histories. Living descendants and open questions. The story of the first Americans does not end in prehistory. Ancient DNA reveals that many of their genetic signatures are still present in indigenous populations today. In regions such as the Andes, Mesoamerica, and the North American Great Basin, there is strong continuity between ancient remains and modern communities, affirming that these peoples are direct descendants of the continent's earliest inhabitants. This persistence is striking, given the profound upheavals brought by colonization, disease, and displacement in recent centuries. Genetic diversity among indigenous groups also reflects adaptation to local environments. Highland populations, for example, developed resilience to low oxygen conditions, while Amazonian groups show distinct immune-related traits shaped by their exposure to dense ecosystems. Arctic peoples, including the Inuit, carry additional influences from later contacts with Siberia, further demonstrating the dynamic history of human movement. But major questions remain unresolved. Some archaeological sites claim human presence in the Americas more than 20,000 years ago, long before the accepted migration window. If confirmed, such dates would point to earlier, possibly failed migration attempts. Similarly, the faint Australasian signal detected in South America remains a mystery. Was it the result of a separate migration wave, or is it an artifact of limited sampling? Challenges also extend beyond science. Ancient DNA studies touch on sensitive issues of ancestry and cultural identity. Increasingly, researchers work directly with indigenous communities to ensure that genetic research is conducted with respect, transparency, and shared decision-making. As sequencing methods improve, new discoveries will continue to refine the timeline and reveal hidden lineages. Yet even with cutting-edge tools, the central truth stands. The indigenous peoples of the Americas are not newcomers, but the living heirs of a history stretching back more than 15,000 years. A mosaic of origins. The story of the first Americans is no longer the simple tale once told in classrooms, where the Clovis first model framed the past as a single migration. 13,000 years ago, ancient DNA has revealed a far richer and deeper history. The first peoples of the Americas were born from a fusion of ancient North Eurasians and East Asians, shaped during a long isolation in Beringia. From there, they spread rapidly, diversifying into northern and southern lineages, giving rise to the astonishing variety of indigenous communities that endured for millennia. Their DNA also carried echoes of older humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, whose genes provided crucial adaptations. Some of these fragments remain active in indigenous populations today, reminders that survival in a new world was built on inheritances stretching back far into prehistory. Yet much remains unresolved. Questions about possible earlier arrivals, unexplained Australasian links, and unsampled regions of the continent keep this field moving forward. What is certain is that indigenous peoples embody the living legacy of these ancient journeys, their roots reaching back to the very dawn of settlement in the Americas. Ancient DNA has given us the most detailed glimpse yet into these origins. But it also shows that the human story here, like elsewhere, is not one of a single beginning, but a mosaic of migrations, adaptations, and enduring continuity. The first Americans were many things: travelers, survivors, inheritors. Above all, they were the founders of a story still unfolding today.